What is wrong with White Mage? Well, it's complicated, and depending on who you ask, the job can range from perfectly fine, to not worth using, to just a bit lacking, to blood for the blood lily. So, let's talk about that. For a short introduction, as well as a bit of a positive to start with, White Mage, as it is a perfectly capable and fine job. In fact, if Savage log statistics are anything to go by, it is still the most popular healer in Final Fantasy XIV, which is actually really important given the context of Savage raiding and the fact that while double barrier healer is a composition that has some popularity, double pure healer simply is not. So the fact White Mage still wins despite that further emphasizes its popularity. Among the four healers, White Mage has probably the simplest, most straightforward toolkit. That doesn't mean there isn't depth in making the most of it, but the fact a large part of White Mage healing relies directly on the GCD through their Lily spells means that when compared to the other healers, White Mage can feel like it accomplishes with a single button what the other healers do with two or more, making for a more slower, calculated feeling pace. Thanks to options like Plenary Indulgence, Cure 3, and Asylum, not to mention Lilybell, White Mage has the most reliable access to ludicrous amounts of healing, where, yes, each of the other healers have ways to rival that, but the barrier healers rely on 3-minute cooldowns to do so, and Astrologian tends to need to Galaxy Brain, both practically and visually, to do so. Between the four healers, White Mage also has the greatest MP control. While slightly deflated by the fact White Mage is also the healer with the most expensive heal, Cure 3 again, not to mention the increased spending during Presence of Mind, the combination of Lilies and Asais saves and recovers 2350 MP per minute, which puts White Mage in second place after Sage's 2567 from Passive Adderskull and Rizomata. But then Eclair 4 is also free, which adds an extra 600 MP save per minute, and White Mage also saves anywhere between 400 and 2400 per minute through the use of Thin Air, which means White Mage is almost always the best healer to have when things go sideways, which is a strange quality to have. And finally, thanks to Aflato's misery, White Mage ranks in the top 3 of non-limited jobs with the strongest single-hit attack in the game, only bested by Monk's Riddler Fire and Brotherhood boosted Phantom Rush, and Ninja's Kasatsu, Kunai's Bane, and Dokomori boosted Hyoshoranryu. But with all of that stated, let's talk about what is wrong with White Mage. First option problem. In Final Fantasy XIV, when you make your character initially, if you want to be a damage dealer, you have 2 melee options, 2 mage options, and the classic archer. If you want to be a tank, you have the choice between the classic sword and board and the more unusual axe wielder. If you want to be a healer, your options are: do you want conjurer or conjurer? Based on this alone, White Mage, the job, has almost the same kind of advantage an MSQ mandatory duty has, in that the probability everyone has at least tried it over the other healers is massively increased, as each of the other healers come with some sort of asterisk to access them, so any player that wants to be a healer specifically will start with Conjurer. This also means that a lot of players that do this may simply choose to stick with White Mage because that is what they're familiar with, long before they even have the choice to try something else. Scholar, you'd need to play a DPS for a short while, relatively speaking. Astrologian, you need to clear the entirety of the ARR MSQ, which takes over 12 hours to speedrun as a conjurer, because that happens to be the meta for that, fun fact. And for Sage, well, that one isn't available in the free trial at all, and you would need to hit level 70 as well, which arguably might take longer than accessing Astrologian depending on how you go about it. While being the first pick is itself not a problem, that it happens frequently has a tendency to give White Mage a bit of a bad reputation because it increases the probability that a player making a lot of the common healer mistakes happens to also be a White Mage, which then makes the job look worse socially. Which I know is a weird aspect to bring forth, but it does matter for how we sometimes discuss these jobs. This also somewhat conveniently leads into the next topic. Late Bloomer. Among healers, there are various breakpoints, quote-unquote, in levels where some crucial action or trait is unlocked. However, arguably, White Mage is the slowest of the four on the uptake on every single one of these breakpoints. The one point where White Mage tends to win in this aspect is that in most level ranges, White Mage is, thanks to SI's presence of mind and the strongest dot, the strongest healer at single target personal damage output, closely followed by Sage. AoE is more up in the air at times. On the negative side then, in the level range of 18 Sastasha to 50, unless you specifically need Cure 3 or the at times convenient property that Regen does not have upfront healing on it, Hail Leviathan Extreme, then Astrologian does pretty much anything better than White Mage, and arguably the barrier healers do too, although they do things differently, so not as clear a comparison. By level 60, White Mage finally has a more even match with Astrologian on tools, but Astrologian still has more. In fact, many would probably agree that White Mage's toolkit isn't properly in order until level 76, where Flator's Rapture is learned, 2 levels after Flator's Misery. Some would argue that barrier healers are not properly fully online, quote-unquote, before they get the regen effect on their Sacred Soils and Caracolis, which happen at level 78, but I would at least say that this is less crucial than a Flator's Rapture, personally. While White Mage being a bit of a late bloomer is not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't help much for the job's reputation when there is a huge level range where arguably any other healer would be preferable if you don't have a personal soft spot for the job. And this also leads to Outlier. In a party composition for, say, a dungeon, your healer being a White Mage is a distinctly different dungeon run from any other healer, where, while the other 3 are also slightly different in their approach, function in a way where the dungeon run won't feel as different from their mere presence. This is mostly relevant for the tank, and indeed I have a video from a while back explaining how each healer works, but from the tank's perspective. Link in the description. Originally, White Mage stood out even more than it does now, but with the Dawntrail change that Holy now only has a 1.5 second cast, still weird that, White Mages at least feel a bit less inclined to play chicken with the tank's HP bar, but probably more than the other healers still. What really makes White Mage stand out here is actually Holy itself, the only AoE stun available to non-limited jobs in Final Fantasy XIV. Inconveniently, it is attached to White Mage's reliable AoE option, meaning that the stuns are coming whether you want them or not. This effect can also cover some of White Mage's weaknesses in the dungeons where it is still lacking options, as if the enemies are not attacking, then no healing is needed. At the same time though, this chained 7-second stun both takes away everyone else's ability to use stuns strategically, if needed, and also can be less valuable if the tank isn't playing around it, as this can mean the tank wastes mitigation during this period where nothing is happening anyway. If the tank isn't fast to position the enemies, Holy can also lock them in an awkward position for a while, reducing the potential damage output of the party. Essentially, this property is not that big of a deal, but simply because White Mage sort of uniquely stands out among the healers for having it, it feels like a bigger deal. Anything you can do, I can do better. When it comes to harder content, the greatest problem White Mage faces is that while it can quickly heal up the party after a large amount of damage, so can Astrologian. Between the two healers, White Mage can heal somewhat more and more easily, while Astrologian has more technical options. And the bigger deal for many, more mitigation and synergistic options in its toolkit. Astrologian has an additional, very short 10% mitigation every minute in Collective Unconscious, but a lot of the time, you don't need more than 5 seconds on that buff. Bowl, while somewhat situationally available, also gives Astrologian one more single target mitigation than White Mage wherever relevant. And while extremely specific, the arrow allows the Astrologian to boost all healing received by an individual, which gives Astrologian unique synergy with Scholar's Spread Low combo. Essentially, Astrologian, together with whoever co-healer it has in a hard duty, can heal enough, so White Mage being able to heal more than that, more easily, is often considered redundant. On the other hand, Astrologian having an extra party mitigation tends to come up as the quintessential reason that Astrologian has an advantage defensively. On the offensive angle, between the pure healers, White Mage is considered the selfish quote-unquote healer, while Astrologian is the raid buff quote-unquote healer. What this means, combined with some of the other advantageous properties of White Mage I listed earlier, is that White Mage performs better in one way or another the lower the average skill level of a team is. On the defensive side, White Mage can raise more players over the course of a fight thanks to Thin Air, and having more big healing buttons makes White Mage more reliably capable of dealing with individual mistakes and players taking unnecessary damage. On the offensive side, the fact White Mage does more personal damage means that White Mage's performance is less impacted by a bad team than Astrologian would be. The simple fact that Astrologian has several cooldowns that simply work better when you can predict what is going to happen also means that it requires significantly more skill to get full value out of the job, and again, I guess fittingly, can make Astrologian slightly weaker in unpredictable scenarios. However, it is worth pointing out that due to how raid buffs work, Astrologian has a tendency to win out significantly even in the average party, and by a lot in more masterful teams, which also leads to the last topic. The weakest link restriction. In Final Fantasy XIV, outside of very specific exceptions, if any, every job is viable and is capable of clearing all the content, assuming you're skilled enough. However, a way this kind of design can be accomplished is by observing whoever is the weakest link for a given context. For instance, Savage bosses tend to have DPS checks. To make sure any balanced group composition can beat said DPS check, it must be balanced in such a way that the specific combination of the 2 tanks that do the least damage, the 2 healers that do the least damage, and the 4 DPS in a balanced composition that do the least damage can beat that DPS check in whatever equipment the duty is balanced for. This would also mean that using any composition that is better than that, or perhaps is more skilled or more geared than expected, would make this DPS check easier to beat. If, for example, the strongest composition could deal, say, 20% more combined DPS than the weakest composition, then it is possible that the fight would seem almost outright trivial when using such a group composition. This may sound familiar. So, how does this relate to White Mage? Well, since White Mage outright has less mitigation options than Astrologian, and a balanced party composition supposedly has a pure healer and a barrier healer, we could assume in a hypothetical duty perfectly balanced on a knife's edge that for White Mage to be viable in said duty, Astrologian's mitigation provided by Collective Unconscious must be assumed to be redundant, because if it is necessary, then bringing White Mage would require you to have some other job provide the missing mitigation option, which would immediately make this hypothetical duty an exception where it wouldn't be possible to win with just any balanced party composition, as White Mage specifically would suddenly be required to be accompanied by certain other jobs to cover for its weaknesses. Is that a bad thing? Not necessarily, but it could reflect badly on White Mage. In contrast, between the pure healers, Astrologian can be assumed to be the weakest link on raw healing, as White Mage spends a bit more of its toolkit on healing. So, in a similar way, if Collective Unconscious can't make up this difference, for example, then Astrologian would have a slightly harder time healing the party. However, a key difference between being the weakest link on mitigation and being the weakest link on healing is that while Astrologian could simply cast an extra Helios conjunction or two, White Mage cannot sacrifice glares to mitigate better. In conclusion, as I said at the beginning, White Mage is actually a fine job and perfectly capable of beating all of the content the game has to offer. In fact, White Mage is capable of doing some things the other healers simply cannot, with Cure 3 enabling White Mage to most reliably provide a massive burst of healing amongst the healers. White Mage also is probably the easiest of the 4 healers to pick up and use decently well. That doesn't mean it doesn't have depth. It also has the only AoE stun available to normal jobs, and between healers, also has the greatest personal damage potential. All of these properties mean that White Mage can very well be the best pick for both a less experienced healer player and for covering the weaknesses of a less experienced party. When it comes to optimizing though, Astrologian has a tendency to get ahead in most of the relevant disciplines, either by a bit or by a lot, which makes White Mage look a lot worse by comparison. In my personal opinion, the greatest weaknesses of White Mage boil down to 2 things. First, if, for example, Plenary Indulgence provided a short 10% mitigation just like Collective Unconscious can, then White Mage would no longer be objectively weaker in that specific aspect. And second, if White Mage learned some of its more crucially important tools a bit earlier, as an example, I think the job should have some version of Aflator's Misery by level 60, and Aflator's Rapture too. Then it wouldn't feel nearly as slow to develop. A third possible problem isn't damage potential. However, whether Astrologian is maybe a bit overtuned on that or the selfish healers are a bit undertuned is really hard to gauge, and as long as all 4 healers are generally considered viable in the hardest content and not excluded because of damage potential, it is probably fine. And to be fair, White Mage has received small damage buffs in nearly every single patch since Dawntrail's release, so things are coming, albeit slowly. That said, all of these weaknesses are insignificant enough that White Mage is still a perfectly good and fine job. Just maybe not if you're trying to be the best in the world. But what do you think? Is White Mage your go-to healer? Why? Why not? Maybe you prefer a different healer due to some of the weaknesses I went over in this video, or maybe something completely different. I would love to hear your opinions in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Twitch or Ko-Fi, links in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, Endwalker's release featured a stat squish, but also a potency squish. A lot of actions had their potency significantly reduced. One example is Dia, which prior to Endwalker had a potency of 120, which was cut in half with Endwalker's release. Every buff this spell has received has been +5 potency to the upfront and dot damage, once in late Endwalker, and so far 4 times in Dawntrail. So for now, the potency is 85 in patch 7.3.